She didn't realize it all at once. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no shocking confession or late-night argument, but a slow accumulation of small details she had ignored for too long. The way plans were always tentative, the way she was introduced vaguely, the way future conversations somehow never included her unless she pushed them there. And at first, she told herself this was just how modern relationships worked, that people were busy, cautious, emotionally careful. But over time, she began to notice a pattern that felt heavier than coincidence. Because whenever something better appeared in his life, a work opportunity, an old friend, an unexpected invitation, she was the one quietly moved to the background, never openly rejected, just softly postponed. And what unsettled her most was not his behavior alone, but how easily she adjusted herself around it, shrinking expectations, lowering needs, convincing herself that patience was the same as understanding. And one evening, sitting alone with her phone in her hand, rereading messages that promised effort without ever delivering it, she felt a sudden clarity settle in her chest. Not anger, not sadness, but recognition. The realization that she wasn't being chosen later, she was being kept just in case. And this understanding didn't arrive with drama, it arrived with calm. A calm that made her finally ask herself a question she had avoided for months. If she stopped waiting, would anything actually change? And as that thought took root, she understood that the hardest part wouldn't be walking away from him, but walking away from the version of herself that had accepted being optional while calling it love. After that realization settled in, she began replaying moments she had once dismissed as harmless, conversations where she felt slightly uneasy but chose not to speak, weekends left deliberately undefined, promises framed as "we'll see" instead of plans. And the more she revisited them, the clearer it became that the pattern had always been there, hidden beneath charm and just enough attention to keep her invested. Because he never disappeared completely. He always resurfaced at the exact moment she started to pull back, offering warmth, affection, reassurance that made her doubt her own instincts. And she recognized how skillfully ambiguity had been used to maintain control without responsibility, how being understanding had slowly turned into emotional self-erasure. And what hurt most wasn't that he hadn't committed, but that she had silently negotiated against herself to make the situation feel acceptable, telling herself she was low maintenance, modern, flexible, when in reality she was suppressing the very needs that made her human. And one night, scrolling through social media, she noticed how publicly intentional he was with certain people in his life, how effort suddenly appeared when it mattered to him. And instead of jealousy, she felt something quieter and more decisive, an internal shift where denial finally loosened its grip, because the evidence no longer felt threatening, it felt explanatory. And in that moment, she stopped asking why she wasn't enough and started asking why she had stayed somewhere she was never fully chosen, realizing that being a backup plan doesn't start with someone else's choices. It starts when you accept uncertainty as a substitute for respect. And as that truth settled in, she knew that continuing would mean betraying herself, and leaving would mean finally aligning her actions with what she had always felt but never allowed herself to name. The days that followed were quieter than she expected, not dramatic or chaotic, but filled with a strange stillness that forced her to sit with herself without distraction. And in that silence, she noticed how much mental energy she had been spending anticipating his moods, interpreting delayed replies, rehearsing casual responses so she wouldn't seem too eager or too demanding. And once that constant background noise disappeared, she felt both relief and grief at the same time. Relief that her mind was finally her own again, and grief for how normalized emotional uncertainty had become in her daily life, because she had mistaken tension for passion and inconsistency for depth, believing that love was supposed to feel slightly unstable, like something you had to earn repeatedly. And as she replayed old messages and memories, she realized how often she had accepted partial truths simply because they were delivered gently. How "I'm just busy" and "now isn't the right time" had functioned as permanent placeholders rather than temporary states. And what surprised her most was not the disappointment itself, but how familiar it felt, echoing earlier experiences where she had also shrunk her expectations to fit someone else's limitations. And with that awareness came a deeper understanding that this pattern wasn't about him alone, but about her own fear of asking for clarity and risking rejection, because ambiguity felt safer than an explicit no, and staying felt easier than confronting the possibility that she might have been investing in something that was never meant to grow. And yet, as uncomfortable as these realizations were, they also brought a sense of grounding, because for the first time, she wasn't trying to fix the situation or reinterpret it into something more hopeful. She was simply seeing it as it was, without urgency or self-blame. And that clarity, though heavy, felt honest, like the beginning of a relationship not with someone else, but with her own boundaries, which she now understood were not demands, but reflections of self-respect she had postponed for far too long. As the clarity settled in, she began to notice subtle shifts in how she moved through her days, small but meaningful changes that would have gone unnoticed before. Like how she no longer checked her phone first thing in the morning with a mix of hope and anxiety, or how evenings felt longer, not empty, but open, giving her space to reconnect with parts of herself she had quietly set aside. And in those moments, she started reflecting on how easily modern connection blurs emotional responsibility, how constant access can create the illusion of closeness without the substance of commitment. And she recognized how often she had confused availability with intention, mistaking frequent contact for genuine presence. And this realization was uncomfortable because it forced her to confront not just his limitations, but her own willingness to accept uncertainty as normal. And yet, instead of spiraling into self-criticism, she felt something steadier emerging, a calm resolve rooted in self-awareness. Because she was no longer trying to decode mixed signals or assign meaning to silence, she was allowing absence to speak for itself. And that honesty stripped the situation of its emotional fog, revealing how much of the connection had depended on her effort alone, her emotional labor, her patience, her capacity to wait. And once she saw that imbalance clearly, it became impossible to ignore, not in a dramatic or bitter way, but with a quiet certainty that she deserved reciprocity without having to negotiate for it. And as she moved through familiar places, coffee shops, sidewalks, late-night routines, she felt a growing sense of alignment between her thoughts and actions, because for the first time she wasn't overriding her intuition to preserve a connection, she was honoring it. And that shift marked a turning point, not because everything suddenly felt resolved, but because she had stopped abandoning herself in moments where clarity asked her to choose truth over comfort. And in doing so, she began laying the foundation for a different kind of love, one built on mutual presence rather than emotional guessing, a love that would meet her where she stood instead of keeping her suspended in uncertainty. With that foundation quietly forming beneath her, she started to experience her independence not as isolation, but as expansion, noticing how her thoughts no longer revolved around anticipation or disappointment, but around possibility. And this shift changed the rhythm of her days in ways that felt both unfamiliar and grounding, because she was no longer measuring her worth through someone else's responsiveness, no longer editing her emotions to remain easy to keep, and as a result, her inner world felt louder, clearer, more alive. And she began to understand how often in her late 20s and early 30s, she had been taught to be flexible at the cost of being honest, to be patient when clarity was missing, to interpret inconsistency as complexity rather than a lack of readiness. And this awareness didn't harden her, it softened her toward herself, because she could finally see that her longing for connection had never been weakness, only misdirected trust. And once she reclaimed that trust inwardly, she found herself more selective, not guarded, but intentional, paying attention to how conversations made her feel afterward, whether she felt energized or steadily diminished, whether her presence was met with curiosity or convenience. And these observations became quiet guideposts rather than rules, helping her navigate relationships with a steadier sense of self. And even moments of loneliness felt different now, less like something to escape and more like a signal to listen inwardly. Because solitude was no longer a waiting room for someone else's arrival, it was a space where she could recalibrate, reflect, and choose with clarity. And as she looked ahead, she realized that the love she wanted was not dramatic or consuming, but consistent and calm, something that added to her life rather than distracting her from it. And this realization didn't close her heart, it refined it, allowing her to stay open without losing herself, hopeful without being naive, and grounded enough to recognize that the right connection would not require her to shrink, wait, or wonder where she stood, because it would meet her with the same presence she had finally learned to give herself. As time passed, she began to notice how differently she moved through the world when she was no longer driven by the quiet anxiety of proving herself. Because without that constant internal pressure, her choices felt slower but more deliberate, and she found herself pausing before saying yes, not out of fear, but out of respect for her own energy. Realizing how often in her 20s she had mistaken availability for openness and busyness for purpose. And now in her early 30s, she was learning that depth required space, not constant motion. And this understanding reshaped even the smallest moments of her life, from how she spent her evenings to how she approached new connections, because she was no longer seeking intensity as a shortcut to meaning, but consistency as a sign of emotional maturity. And while part of her once believed that passion had to be chaotic to be real, she now understood that stability did not dull desire, it protected it, allowing attraction to grow without fear of collapse. And this insight made her more attentive to her own patterns, noticing when she felt the urge to chase clarity from people who offered ambiguity. And instead of judging herself for that impulse, she met it with curiosity, asking what need was being activated and whether it truly belonged to the present moment. And through this self-observation, she developed a deeper sense of trust in herself because she could finally differentiate between intuition and habit, between genuine interest and emotional familiarity. And this clarity did not isolate her, it liberated her, making room for connections that felt mutual rather than effortful, reciprocal rather than performative. And even when uncertainty appeared, it no longer destabilized her sense of worth, because she understood that not every unanswered question required resolution. Some simply required acceptance. And with this acceptance came a quieter confidence, one that didn't announce itself or demand validation, but showed up in how she listened, how she responded, and how she allowed relationships to unfold at a pace that honored both presence and boundaries. And as she continued forward, she knew she was no longer building her life around the hope of being chosen, but around the certainty that she was already choosing herself again and again in ways that felt grounded, honest, and sustainable. By this point, she had started to recognize a subtle but important shift in how she related to her own expectations, because where she once measured progress by visible milestones and external approval, she now evaluated her life by how aligned it felt internally. And this change altered her relationship with time itself, making her less impatient with uncertainty and more tolerant of periods that looked unproductive from the outside, but were deeply formative within. And she realized that much of the pressure she once felt in her late 20s came from absorbing timelines that were never designed for her individual rhythm. Timelines that rewarded speed over substance and certainty over self-awareness. And as she released herself from those comparisons, she noticed how her body responded with relief, how decisions no longer carried the same urgency to be finalized or justified, because she trusted that clarity could evolve without being forced. And this trust allowed her to approach relationships, work, and even solitude with a steadier presence, no longer interpreting pauses as failures or silence as rejection, but as information, neutral and often necessary. And through this lens, she became more selective, not in a guarded or fearful way, but in a discerning one, understanding that access to her time and emotional energy was not something to be negotiated away for potential connection. And this discernment made her more honest in conversations, less inclined to over-explain or soften truths to maintain harmony, because she had learned that real connection could withstand discomfort, while superficial harmony often collapsed under it. And as she practiced this honesty, she felt a growing sense of integrity, a feeling that her inner values were finally reflected in her outward choices. And although this alignment did not eliminate doubt or moments of loneliness, it changed how she experienced them, because doubt no longer felt like a threat to her identity, and loneliness no longer signaled inadequacy, but simply the space between chapters. And in that space, she found a deeper respect for herself, a quiet confidence rooted not in achievement or validation, but in self-consistency. And this confidence influenced how she showed up each day, less reactive, more intentional, aware that a meaningful life was not built through constant certainty, but through the willingness to stay present while clarity continued to unfold. In the end, she understood that nothing was actually missing from her life, only the belief that she needed to arrive somewhere else to feel complete. And once that belief softened, she stopped rushing herself toward imagined futures and began living more fully inside the present one, allowing her choices to come from clarity rather than pressure. And although her life did not suddenly become simpler or easier, it became more honest. And not honesty brought a calm she had never known before, a quiet assurance that she was not behind, not late, and not failing, but exactly where she needed to be to continue becoming herself.